It is the original skeleton type, dating back all the way back from the days of Medarot R in 1999. It is GLT00 Gairot, with a kit of laser, hammer, beam sword, multi-legs, and the leg ability of heavy arms, which buffs all leg stats, minus armor and heavy limit for every heavy part equipped between 10 and 11% additively. Now, as another very welcome addition from the days of old, it's really nice to see yet another model come back with a fresh design, with a fresh 3D model, and a very, very beautiful art as well to join the fray in the game of Medarot S. Now, granted that even though Gairot is an event reward and may be slightly expensive to raise, I do have to admit, just looking at his numbers from point blank, he is going to be a very chunky fellow, but most certainly does not deviate from the original kit he had even in the early days of Medarot R, which was, quite unfortunately, before S, the only game he actually ever debuted in. Laser on the head part is an optic attribute skill that gets a times 1.5 damage bonus at 30% charge, and a times 2 bonus at 100% charge. And with the packing a base power of over 2k, it's going to hit pretty moderately hard even if it doesn't have a charge to it. Albeit, you do kind of have to pay attention to the fact that he does have a relatively low heat and cool, between 435 on the heat and 501 for the cool, and a very low success as well at just barely 800. Which means that while he may hit pretty hard, that's assuming that he's actually going to land the hit, and given he only has 2 charges, you may want to make sure you time that carefully. Hammer on the right arm is a conventional melee skill that has a full AoE type of attack, which means it will damage all the parts equally and spread the damage across all active parts of the target. The only time this is negated is if the enemy has conceal effect or if it's a shield that is sponging the damage. But hammers are also very good in the instance that they can be used to flush out leaders thanks to Silent Leader. Beam Sword on the left arm is an optic attribute skill, much like Laser, but packs a times 2 damage bonus at 30% charge and a times 3 bonus at 100% charge. And packing passive pierce damage on that means it's going to be probably the most conventional skill that Gairot has on his kit, especially given that because it is Metaforce reliant, the more charge he has, the more powerful it gets the longer the fight drags on. Multi-legs means he's going to have relatively solid coverage across most terrains, and when it comes to terrain matching, usually the second best under biped with diversity, and this spider jockey usually makes it pretty clear that not a lot of terrains are really going to bug him, especially given that with heavy arms, even if he is relatively tanky before, he is going to be even tankier just by using him as a pure set or packing him up with the weight. Now when it comes to numbers, he's packing about 3,900 HP for the head, about 4,200 per arm, and about 4,500 for the leg, so he is a very healthy boy despite being nothing but skin and bones, pun intended I suppose. And with his leg stats, it's kind of a mixed bag as well. With a base mobility of 418, he's definitely not going anywhere fast, and the same can be said with his evade at 412. He is definitely not going to put an emphasis on dodging or grazing, and he's going to be focusing pretty heavily on being able to tank blows with his very high armor and his damage reduction, with a solid 1375 in both melee and shoot resist. Packing some pretty solid base damage reduction and armor means it's going to be pretty tough to take this guy down. But that's also not including heavy arms before it's brought into play. If you fully pack him up with the weight, or use him as a pure set in this case with heavy arms, he is going to be packing a pretty solid damage reduction. I think at my last number and count was about 1,800 or so, probably closer to 2k if my numbers were accurate. So which means he's going to be even harder to take down or even harder to break because of all the weight he's packing. Now, of course, that does mean that his mobility and his evade may not necessarily come up to snuff, and you may have to come to terms with the fact that using him will not be the fastest enemy on the field. But with the armor and damage reduction he's packing, he can probably make it work. Now, one other thing to notice as well is the fact that this is also the first ever instance of heavy arms on a multi-ped leg, so he's most certainly going to be bringing a lot of diversity to the table, and even if the mobility and the evade are low, just that fact alone, if you're willing to play with the numbers enough, is probably just enough to forgive it. All this being said though, as a pure set score, while Gairot is relatively well-rounded and pretty fairly synergetic with himself, I still do have to rate him a pretty lower middle of the road, kind of 5.5 out of 10. And it's primarily for the fact that while Laser, Hammer, and Beam Sword themselves are definitely not bad skills, and Heavy Arms, even with the low mobility, is not terrible either, it's primarily the fact that he's going to be very, very slow at heat stats between the mid 400s to even the low 500s, maybe, and the cooldown stats basically in that same range, which means he's not going anywhere anytime soon. And in addition to this, his success stat between just barely 800 on Laser, just barely high 600s for his Hammer, and just barely 500 for that Beam Sword, he is going to be very hella blind. So while he may have some pretty solid base power before modifiers between all three of his skills, it's going to be a very large flip of the coin to determine if he actually hits, and an additional flip of the coin if he's going to land the hit or if the enemy is going to graze it, which will further reduce his damage even more so. And with the Heavy Arms, while it does comp a good chunk of his lower skills, such as mobility and evade, that is going to be a really high number you have to juggle if you plan to use him as a pure set. As mixed parts, though, I have to rate him just a little bit higher at a 6.5 out of 10. While again, his parts by themselves can be used well if you build them right, because they are still worth using if you can comp their lower numbers. The legs alone is probably going to be the really big game changer here, because while it does have a potential to use the Heavy Arms with multi-ped legs and actually comp that lower speed, it is going to take a little bit of juggling. But the fact that you can load it on triple heavy parts does mean that it does give you some extra flexibility when putting it on team builds. Just a word of warning though, if you do plan to use Gairot in any capacity, if you do plan to use him, mind the weight, because he will be subject to anyone using Heavy Punish. Between Break Hammer, or Break Rush, or anything of the light, those are absolutely going to be chewing through his high armor and his high HP pool faster than you'd really want to do while he's on the field.